When you hear about the potato famine that took place in Ireland, you think of the potato blight, the disease that destroyed most of the crop for several years. However, one thing that you don't hear about is that the Irish farmers were watching their perfectly good corn crop be shipped to England. This has caused names like the Irish potato genocide to come about, and they actually fit pretty well, because more than 1 million Irish died and another 2 million immigrated. This caused Ireland's population to fall by 1/4 and left the country in quite a bad situation. The disease that actually caused the potatoes to die is known as Phytophthora infestans, or the late blight, and it is a disease that does not show many signs until near the time of harvest. This caused many problems because the farmers could not plant new crops because they had no realization that there was anything wrong with the ones they already had planted. There was also the issue of lack of potato diversity. The Irish depended almost solely on one type of potato, the Irish lumper. This was an issue because it allowed one strain of the disease to kill all of the potatoes instead of having to mutate to better affect other types. If there were other types of potatoes planted, there might have been a chance that there would have been a resistant strain that could have survived. Another reason that this had such a widespread effect is because of the Irish people's extreme dependence on the crop. This dependence was caused by the tenant system that was in place. The tenant system was a system where the rich lords of England, who owned large tracts of land in Ireland, would lease it out to a landlord. This landlord would then divide it into smaller sections. These sections kept getting smaller because the English loved beef and kept using larger and larger portions of land to grow cattle. Eventually land got so scarce that all the farmers were living on plots between the size of 1 to 5 acres. They were often so poor that to stay on their land they would do field work for the landlord to pay their rent. This left only a small portion that they could use for their own personal use, and therefore the only crop that would feed a family was potatoes. There was also the problem that if any improvements were made to the land, it would increase that piece of land's value in the mind of the landlord, and the rent would actually go up. This caused farmers not to want to make any improvements, and overall they just were living on a field-to-mouth existence. The largest years of starvation were between 1845 and 1848. The disease was probably brought over from American ships coming from New York or Philadelphia, and it first affected Europe in places like Belgium and France in 1844. By 1845 it had reached Ireland, and this is where the real trouble began. In the harvest of 1845, only 1/2 to 2/3 of the normal crop yield was harvested. By 1846, only 1/4 of the normal amount was harvested. In the fall of 1846, the first deaths due to starvation were reported. In 1847, there were very few seed potatoes to be planted, so although the disease was not as threatening that year, there was still very little harvested. In 1848, a similar thing happened. While the blight only destroyed about 1/4 of that year's harvest, there was very little planted, and therefore not much to collect. The disease sort of slowed down from there, but the damage had already been done. It wasn't until the late 1850s that food was plentiful again, and by this time so many had already died or moved away that the country was left with only 3/4 of their original population. Another large factor that caused a lot of deaths was disease. When a human body goes without food, it starts to catabolize itself, meaning it starts destroying muscle tissue to satisfy the brain's need for energy. This leaves one very weak and prone to already life-threatening disease. This happened in Ireland on a very large scale, and diseases like dysentery, smallpox, chlorea, and influenza ran rampant. It is estimated that almost 90% of the deaths were actually caused by disease and not actual starvation. There were attempts to ease the strain on the poor farmers by local governments. The issue was that England would not open the ports to countries other than themselves, so the Prime Minister of Ireland, Robert Peel, had a hard time purchasing food for a reasonable price. At one point, he illegally purchased 100,000 pounds of American cornmeal and maize. It was not received well by the public because, if not prepared properly, it could cause bowel discomfort. After Peel was done with his term in office, he was replaced by a Whig named John Russell. Russell and his administration believed in the policy of laissez-faire, meaning that the market would provide the food that was needed. By 1847, they had realized that this was not working. Soup kitchens were opened and ran off the funds of local landlords. In June of 1847, the Poor Land Law Amendment Act was passed and stated that landowners should be the one helping poverty and not the ones exploiting them. It was at this point that the gradual change for the better started to happen, and eventually things would return to normal. Overall, the Great Famine, as it is known in Ireland, was a tragedy. More than 1 million died, and all the young men moved away seeking better lives. While the Blight is where most of the blame normally goes, it is important to know that the corrupt expletive lords and landlords and the British refusal to open ports were the main issues. I personally believe that this genocide of the Irish people is not often talked about in a sense that reflects negativity on the British government. I think that if we are to avoid an event like this in the future, it needs to be brought up more often.